An 8-year-old boy became king of a nation drowning in darkness. His grandfather Manasseh was the most evil king in Israel's history, sacrificing children to idols and filling Jerusalem with blood. His father Amon followed the same path and got assassinated after 2 years. Now this kid, Josiah, inherited a kingdom where the temple was ruined, God's law was lost and forgotten, and pagan altars covered every hilltop. Everyone expected him to fail or become another tyrant. Instead, by age 16, he started destroying idol worship with his own hands. By 20, he was smashing altars across the entire nation. Then workers renovating the temple found a scroll buried in the rubble, the book of God's law that had been missing for generations. When they read it to Josiah, he tore his clothes and wept, realizing his entire nation was under a death sentence for breaking every command. The air in Jerusalem is thick not just with dust, but with the cloying scent of burnt offerings to foreign gods, a stench that permeates the palace walls and the very soul of the city. Judah, the last remnant of Israel, is a kingdom drowning in spiritual sewage, a final, desperate outpost on the edge of collapse. The immediate past is a nightmare of generational trauma. Josiah's grandfather, Manasseh, was an architect of darkness, a king who ruled for 55 years, filling the land with pagan worship, building altars to the stars and the fertility gods of the Canaanites, and, most horrifically, sacrificing his own children in the fires of the Valley of Hinnom. The ancient Temple of Solomon, once the glory of the earth, is now a ruined, choked-up shell, its sacred spaces polluted by idols, and its original purpose completely forgotten. Manasseh's death brought no relief. Josiah's father, Amon, inherited the wickedness and continued the same path of spiritual treason for 2 short, brutal years. His reign was a brief, violent echo of his father's evil, confirming the terrifying pattern of the royal line. Amon's end was swift and chaotic. He was assassinated by his own palace officials in a coup fueled by internal intrigue and political desperation. The cycle of blood and apostasy seemed unbreakable, a curse that had consumed the leadership and now threatened to consume the entire nation. The kingdom is a powder keg of fear, corruption, and instability, waiting for the final match to be struck by the rising empires of the north. Into this hell on earth steps Josiah, a boy of only 8 years old, thrust onto the throne by the desperate will of the people who executed his father's assassins. He is surrounded by men who serve his wicked grandfather and father, men who are steeped in the dark magic and political machinations of the court. His childhood is spent navigating a labyrinth of fear and intrigue, a constant, silent battle for survival in a palace where the golden calves of the pagan gods are more visible than the altar of the Lord. Every counselor and court official expects the child king to fail, to become a puppet of the powerful idolatrous priests, or to simply follow the family tradition and become another short-lived, self-serving tyrant. But the young king is not entirely alone. In the shadows of the crumbling court, a small, faithful remnant exists, men whose loyalty is not to the current power structure, but to the memory of the covenant. These faithful mentors, Hilkiah, the high priest, and Shaphan, the scribe, see in the quiet, observant boy a flicker of hope that has been extinguished in the royal line for generations. They subtly begin to sow the seeds of the lost faith, telling him the forbidden stories of King David, the true law, and the God who once made Jerusalem his dwelling place, whispering the truth into an ear that has only ever heard the praises of Baal and Asherah. These first stirrings of a pure faith are sown in the devastated landscape of Josiah's childhood, a profound, internal conflict that no one can see. He walks past the profane altars on the palace grounds, sees the carved images of the gods his family served, and feels the weight of his lineage, the immense spiritual debt left by the 2 kings who preceded him. The internal growth is slow, a personal, burning quest to understand why his kingdom is so broken, why his father was murdered, and why the glorious temple is now a dirty, forgotten ruin. He begins to realize that the chaos around him is not political or military. It is a spiritual consequence, the result of a profound, generational betrayal of the God whose name his ancestors once invoked. The weight of this inheritance is crushing for the boy king. He is a child haunted by the ghosts of his grandfather's child sacrifices and his father's assassination, forced to reconcile the terrifying history of his family with the quiet, persistent promise of his mentors. He sees the despair of his people, who look for hope in the stars and the carved wood, having lost all memory of the true, invisible God. The pressure is immense, a constant demand to conform to the established evil. Yet the stories of the true covenant have taken root, creating a deep-seated spiritual and psychological dissonance that must eventually erupt into action. The court watches, waiting for the boy to choose his path, unaware that the quiet, observant king is already making his decision. He is studying the faces around him, learning who is loyal to the earth gods and who is loyal to the lost covenant, preparing for a confrontation that will be more dangerous and more defining than any foreign invasion. The palace is a powder keg of hidden loyalties, and the 8-year-old king knows that the slightest misstep could lead to the same fate as his father, a swift, brutal death at the hands of his own men. The throne is a curse, but for Josiah, it is also the only place from which he can attempt to save his doomed nation. The first confrontation is coming, a brave, personal choice that will defy the entire legacy of his family. The long, silent apprenticeship of the child king finally ends at the age of 16. This is the year of Josiah's spiritual reckoning, a personal, burning quest for the truth that transcends mere court policy. He has spent 8 years observing the decay, listening to the whispered truths of his mentors, and wrestling with the terrifying legacy of his family. Now, he makes a choice that is not a political maneuver, but a raw, deeply personal commitment. He begins to seek the God of his father David. This is a moment of profound courage, a deliberate act of defiance against the entire established order of Judah, a kingdom where the God of David is an archaic, embarrassing legend. His quest is not confined to the palace. He spends hours with Hilkiah and Shaphan, demanding to know the details of the lost covenant, piecing together the true history of Israel's relationship with the Almighty. He realizes that the chaos and the threat of foreign invasion are not random events, but the inevitable, terrifying consequences of generations of willful disobedience. The nation lives under a curse, a spiritual debt that has been compounded by every idol, every child sacrifice, and every polluted altar. This internal growth is painful, forcing him to accept that the doom hanging over Jerusalem is just, and that his first duty is not to save his crown, but to save his people's soul by leading them back to the truth. By the age of 20, his seeking transforms into a relentless public purge. He begins the dangerous, unpopular mission of cleansing the land, starting with the capital. This is not a subtle reform. It is a violent, iconoclastic campaign designed to shatter the spiritual identity of the kingdom. He commands the destruction of the altars to Baal, the smashing of the sacred stone pillars, and the burning of the Asherah poles, the wooden symbols of the fertility goddess that crown every hilltop. The act of tearing down these ancient, revered symbols is an existential threat to the men who profited from them and a violation of the deep-seated pagan traditions of the people. Josiah's resolve is absolute, moving with a faith that seems reckless and impossible. The purge extends beyond the city, radiating outward to the entire territory of Judah and even into the former northern kingdom, which is under the loose control of the fading Assyrian Empire. He travels to Bethel, the site of the golden calf, the ancient symbol of Israel's first great sin, and personally destroys the altar, grinding the stone to dust. This is a deliberate, symbolic act of erasing the spiritual errors of the past, a declaration that the time for compromise is over and that only the pure worship of the Lord is acceptable within his kingdom. His most shocking and defiant act is the desecration of the graves of the former idolaters. He exhumes the bones of the pagan priests and burns them upon the very altars they once served. This is an act of spiritual warfare that crosses the ancient line between the living and the dead, a final, total humiliation of the pagan power structure. By scattering the burnt bone fragments over the altars, he renders them ritually unclean forever, ensuring that no one can ever worship there again. The act is brutal, uncompromising, and absolutely necessary to break the generations of dark tradition that have enslaved the nation. The mission is fraught with danger. The priests and prophets of the pagan cults are powerful and deeply entrenched. Their wealth and influence tied directly to the altars Josiah is destroying. Every smashed idol is a shattered alliance. Every burnt altar a political enemy created, and the young king moves constantly under the shadow of the assassin's knife, a fate he has already witnessed in his own father. Yet, he moves with a chilling resolve, understanding that the political risk is nothing compared to the spiritual certainty of the curse under which his nation lives. The people watch, stunned and divided. Some are horrified by the destruction of their ancestral traditions. Others are filled with a fragile, dawning hope, seeing in the young king a force that might finally break the terrible cycle of their history. The purge is not merely a religious reform. It is a national identity crisis, forcing every citizen to choose between the comfortable, familiar evil of the past and the demanding, terrifying purity of the lost covenant. The land is being scoured. The physical symbols of sin are being erased, but the fundamental question remains. Can the king burn the sin out of his people's hearts as easily as he burns the wood of the Asherah poles? Josiah, now a man of 20, stands in the ruins of a pagan temple, the smoke of the burnt idols stinging his eyes, the weight of the impossible task pressing down on him. He has broken the spell of his ancestors' evil and established himself as the only truly righteous king in Judah for over a century. The ground is cleansed, but the spiritual vacuum is immense, a silent space waiting to be filled. He has the heart to seek God and the will to destroy evil, but he is still operating on half memory and a few whispered stories. He knows the altars are gone, but he does not yet know the law that must replace them. The final, most crucial piece of the covenant is still missing. Fires scour the altars, but some memories take longer to burn. 6 years after the Great Purge began, when Josiah is 26 years old, he initiates the most visible and hopeful policy of his reign, the restoration of the Temple of Solomon. He sends Shaphan the scribe to Hilkiah the high priest with a clear decree. Use the money collected from the faithful to pay the carpenters, masons, and laborers for the immediate repair of the sacred house, which has been left to rot for decades. This act is a powerful public statement, a declaration that the king is not only destroying the old gods, but is actively rebuilding the sanctuary of the true God. The sight of scaffolding and busy workers around the temple ignites a fragile, collective hope among the people, a sense that the curse might finally be lifting. During the painstaking, deep-cleaning renovation, a moment of profound, world-altering discovery occurs. As the workers are clearing out the rubble, the refuse, and the accumulated filth of generations of neglect from the innermost chambers, Hilkiah the high priest stumbles upon an ancient, dust-caked object, a scroll. It is not just any scroll. It is a parchment of immense age, wrapped and hidden, miraculously preserved from the decades of desecration. Hilkiah instinctively recognizes the weight of his discovery. This is the missing book of the law, the foundational document of the covenant, the very words of God that had been lost and forgotten in the temple's ruins. Hilkiah takes the scroll, his hands trembling, and immediately sends it to Shaphan the scribe, the man who can read and understand the archaic text. Shaphan, realizing the explosive meaning of the parchment, the literal, physical covenant between God and Israel, begins to read it, his voice hushed with awe and terror. The words are absolute, uncompromising, and terrifyingly clear. He reads of the blessings for obedience, but more urgently, He reads of the devastating curses for the kind of apostasy and idolatry that have defined Judah for the last 70 years. He understands that this document is not a historical relic. It is a death sentence hanging over their entire nation. Shaphan carries the scroll to the king, his face pale with the weight of the message. He first gives Josiah a report on the progress of the temple restoration, the good news, but then he brings out the scroll, lays it before the king, and begins to read the ancient, resonant words aloud. The king, who has only known the law through fragments and whispered stories, now hears the full, uncompromising truth of the covenant. He hears the explicit commands against the very altars he has been destroying, and then he hears the explicit, detailed curses, famine, pestilence, the sword, exile, and the utter destruction of Jerusalem, that are the guaranteed consequence of their sin. The effect on Josiah is immediate and shattering. He does not react with political calculation or regal anger. He reacts with the raw, personal terror of a man facing the gallows. He tears his royal clothes to shreds, a traditional, visible act of profound grief and repentance that shocks the court. He weeps uncontrollably, his tears not for his personal safety, but for his nation, realizing with horrifying clarity that every curse written in that ancient text has been earned and is now imminent. He understands that his purge, though righteous, was too little, too late, a small, hopeful gesture against a mountain of generational sin. In his terror and despair, Josiah does not hide the scroll or attempt to suppress its damning contents. Instead, he sends a high-level delegation, including Hilkiah and Shaphan, to the prophetess Huldah, who lives in the second quarter of Jerusalem. He commands them to seek the word of the Lord, to ask if there is any mitigation, any hope, any way to turn back the terrifying doom promised in the scroll. This act is the ultimate submission to the divine word, a final, public acknowledgement that the law is supreme and that the fate of the kingdom rests not with the king's policy, but with the will of God. The nation stands on the edge of a precipice, the scroll's contents spreading like wildfire through the court. The people, who had just begun to hope with the temple's rebuilding, are now faced with the terrifying finality of their history. The discovery of the law is both the greatest hope and the ultimate condemnation, the final, undeniable proof of their guilt. The scroll had been found. Now Josiah had to choose what to do with it. The delegation returns from the prophetess Huldah with a message that is both devastating and personal. Huldah confirms the terrible truth of the scroll. The Lord will indeed bring all the curses written in the book upon Jerusalem and its inhabitants, because they have forsaken him and burned incense to other gods. The doom is sealed, the generational sin too deep, the judgment irreversible. However, she delivers a small, crucial reprieve specifically to the king. Because Josiah's heart was tender, because he humbled himself, tore his clothes, and wept before the Lord upon hearing the words, he will be gathered to his grave in peace. He will not live to see the catastrophe that will befall Jerusalem. The judgment is coming regardless, but Josiah's humility will spare him the sight of his nation's final collapse. Josiah accepts the prophecy, the small window of personal grace only strengthening his resolve to save his people in the time he has left. He issues a command that is unprecedented in the history of Judah. He summons every citizen, from the greatest to the least, from all of Judah and Benjamin, to gather in the temple court. The atmosphere is electric with fear and anticipation. The king stands before the massive throng, and the scribes read the entire book of the law aloud, the ancient words thundering over the gathered crowd, giving every single person the chance to hear the terrifying truth of their covenant. After the reading, Josiah steps forward and stands by the pillar, a solitary figure of immense moral authority. He makes a solemn, public vow before the Lord, to walk after the Lord, to keep his commandments, and to perform the words of the covenant written in the book. Then, he commands the people to enter into the same covenant. The vast crowd responds with a unified, emotional vow of loyalty, a collective moment of repentance that attempts to undo the spiritual damage of a century. The covenant is renewed with the raw, emotional weight of blood and tears, a desperate attempt to reset the national destiny. The public vow is immediately followed by a relentless, final wave of purges, a comprehensive campaign to erase every vestige of idolatry from the land. Josiah personally leads the charge, ensuring the removal of every single pagan vessel and ritual object that had been kept in the temple itself, burning them outside the city and grinding the remnants to dust. He defiles the Topheth in the Valley of Hinnom, the place of child sacrifice, ensuring that no one can ever again make their son or daughter pass through the fire. He destroys the altars to the sun, moon, and stars, and he removes the idolatrous priests who had been appointed by his grandfather and father. The priests who had been loyal to the pagan altars are ruthlessly dealt with. They are stripped of their power and brought to Jerusalem, where they are forbidden from serving at the altar of the Lord, condemned instead to eat unleavened bread among their brethren. This is a severe, definitive break from the past, a clear message that the line between symbol and justice is now absolute. Josiah even rides out to the northern cities, destroying the high places built by King Jeroboam centuries earlier, a symbolic act of unity and total covenantal purity that stretches back to the very first division of the kingdom. The reforms ripple through society, shattering old alliances, dividing families, and creating a new political reality where faithfulness to the covenant is the only path to power. The destruction is total, absolute, and uncompromising, a whirlwind of righteous fury tearing down the spiritual infrastructure of the past. The goal is simple: to make Judah so utterly clean that God will be compelled to dwell among them once more. The physical landscape is purified, the pagan priests are disempowered, and the law of Moses is back on the throne. The blood was wiped clean, but the shadow still lingered, the knowledge that the coming doom was only postponed, not canceled. The spiritual climax of Josiah's reign, the culmination of the discovery of the law and the national purge, is the reinstitution of the ancient Passover celebration. The king issues a decree for the entire nation to gather in Jerusalem to observe the feast, an act of collective memory and spiritual resurrection that has not been witnessed in its fullness since the days of the judges, over 800 years prior. The temple, now completely cleansed and restored, is the center of a national gathering of unprecedented scale and sincerity. The priests and Levites, newly purified and retaught the law, meticulously prepare the sacrifices, ensuring every detail of the ritual is observed according to the long-forgotten instructions in the rediscovered scroll. The celebration is an explosion of national euphoria, a moment where the full, joyous weight of their renewed covenant identity is felt by every participant. Thousands of lambs are sacrificed, the blood spilled and offered in the prescribed manner, a profound, visceral act of atonement and thanks. The people eat the unleavened bread and bitter herbs, consciously connecting their present repentance with the foundational story of their liberation from Egyptian bondage. The Passover is not just a religious holiday. It is the resurrection of their national identity, a collective memory that rekindles the hope that they are still the chosen people, despite the terrifying prophecy of doom. The reforms initiated by Josiah now ripple through the social and legal fabric of the kingdom, moving beyond mere ritual purity to establish true righteousness. The law of Moses, once a lost curiosity, is now the public center of the kingdom, becoming the final word on justice, commerce, and morality. The poor are protected, the land is redistributed according to the ancient statutes, and the entire system of governance is recalibrated to align with the covenant. Judah, for the first time in generations, becomes a nation where the spiritual life and the daily life are meant to be one and the same, a living model of the theocratic ideal. Josiah's success becomes the gold standard against which all future kings will be measured. The scriptures will eventually declare that before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses. Nor after him did any arise like him. He is placed even above the legendary David and the wise Solomon in his faithfulness and his uncompromising adherence to the divine word. The national euphoria is immense, a feeling of being fully alive and fully forgiven, a profound, collective sigh of relief that seems to defy the coming catastrophe. Yet, a dark cloud hangs over this spiritual triumph. The people know the prophecy. The doom is postponed, not canceled. The king's humility has bought them time, but the deep, generational rot of the nation's heart cannot be instantly purged by a single king's righteousness or a single national celebration. The return to the law is a glorious, fleeting moment, but the spiritual change is not yet deep enough to withstand the coming storm. The question that haunts the court and the prophets is whether the people's repentance is genuine and lasting, or merely a temporary, fear-driven reaction to the terrifying words of the newly found scroll. The kingdom is outwardly clean, inwardly fragile, and politically isolated. The great powers are moving on the horizon. The Assyrian Empire is collapsing. Egypt is rising, and the terrifying shadow of Babylon is growing in the east. Josiah's reign of reform and peace has been a miracle in a time of chaos, a small, bright beacon of righteousness in a rapidly darkening world. But the historical forces that Huldah prophesied are still in motion, and the king, who has successfully fought the spiritual battles within his borders, must soon face the inevitable, brutal reality of the foreign empires closing in. They sang psalms in the streets and waited for the next blow to fall. The fragile peace and spiritual euphoria of Josiah's reform cannot hold back the tide of global politics. The prophecy of doom, though postponed, looms over the kingdom like a persistent, heavy storm cloud. The empires that dominate the ancient world are in motion. Assyria, the old enemy, is collapsing, creating a power vacuum that ambitious nations are eager to fill. Egypt, under Pharaoh Necho, is marching north to intervene in the final, desperate struggle for control, and the terrifying, relentless force of Babylon is preparing to assert its dominance over the entire region. Judah, a small, righteous kingdom squeezed between these giants, is destined to be crushed in the collision. Josiah, the king who successfully fought the spiritual battles within his own borders, now faces a political and military crisis he cannot avoid. Pharaoh Necho is marching his army through the coastal plain of Judah on his way to aid the Assyrians against the Babylonians. Josiah, perhaps driven by a misguided sense of national independence, or perhaps by a fatalistic belief that the law commanded him to oppose all foreign powers, makes his fatal error. He rides out with his army to confront the mighty Egyptian force at Megiddo, a place whose name will forever be synonymous with final, decisive battle. A message is delivered to Josiah from Pharaoh Necho himself, a chilling warning that seems to carry a supernatural authority. What have I to do with you, King of Judah? I have not come against you this day, but against the house with which I have war. God has commanded me to make haste. Stop for your own sake from interfering with God, who is with me, lest he destroy you. Josiah ignores the warning, a final, tragic lapse in judgment for a man whose life was defined by obedience. He disguises himself and rides into the battle, choosing to fight a war that was not his to fight, an act of political defiance that overrides the spiritual wisdom of his entire reign. The battle is short, brutal, and utterly disastrous. Josiah, the greatest reformer and the most righteous king, is struck by an arrow, mortally wounded in the thick of the fighting. He is pulled from the fray, placed in a chariot, and rushed back to Jerusalem, but the journey is too late. The king dies upon his arrival, a hero cut down in a pointless, foreign war, his righteous life concluding in a moment of tragic, avoidable error. The shock that rips through Jerusalem is immediate and profound, transforming the national euphoria of the Passover into a collective, inconsolable agony. The mourning for Josiah is a national outpouring of grief, a final, honest testament to the love and hope he had inspired. The people, the priests, and the great prophet Jeremiah all weep for the king who had given them back their God and their identity. He is buried in his own tomb. A righteous man gathered to his rest, spared the terrible sight of the final doom. But his death is the instantaneous signal for the political collapse Huldah had foreseen. The vacuum of his authority is immediately filled by the old corruption. The collapse is swift and merciless. Josiah's sons, who ascend the throne after him, quickly abandon his righteous reforms and revert to the idolatry and wickedness of their grandfather, Manasseh, proving that the heart of the nation was indeed too hard to change. Egypt asserts its dominance, installing puppet kings and draining the treasury. Finally, Babylon arrives, relentless and unstoppable. Within 2 decades of Josiah's death, Jerusalem is besieged. The temple, the one Josiah so lovingly restored, is burned to the ground, and the people are dragged into the Babylonian exile. Yet, the king's legacy, though seemingly ending in failure and destruction, is the spiritual foundation upon which the nation will rebuild. The rediscovery of the law, the model of total covenantal reform, and the defiance of evil, all of these acts ensured that the truth was never lost again. The book of the law, the very scroll that had terrified him, traveled with the exiles to Babylon, becoming the central text that defined their identity and their hope for return. Josiah could not save his nation from the inevitable historical consequence of its past sins, but his righteous action planted seeds of faith and recorded a model of perfect obedience that time could not uproot, a beacon for all future generations.